if you make everybody monsters and they're not human beings, well, you can't do diplomacy with monsters. You can't you can't negotiate with monsters, but you can with humans. And like, I'm sure there are, like to our earlier discussion, like maybe there are times where you shouldn't negotiate or you can't negotiate with humans, but it's better if you can. And we could use a lot more of that thinking.
Can we take that idea and move to the war in Ukraine?
Sure.
What do you think is the path for peace there?
Well, I think what Trump is pursuing is like infinitely preferable to what Biden was doing. What puts Donald Trump, and I don't think everything he's done has been perfect, and I really did not like that mineral deal that he was floating out for a while there, and I think maybe that might be the best thing that came out of that Oval Office thing, is that maybe that, Donald Trump goes, it's going to be very tough to do business like this, and it's like, yeah, we shouldn't be doing this business deal anyway. But and by the way, I don't think we should do it on a few number one, principally, I think it is kind of like bullying Ukraine out of resources, and from what I understand, they don't even have that many like fine minerals, but whatever. But it's also like, well, look, if he was selling it to Zelensky, that's kind of a security guarantee. Because like, hey, if we're in business, then if Putin messes with you, he's messing with us. But from my perspective, like that's the whole point, is you don't want to get into the business of giving out security guarantees. I mean, this is why George Washington was against entangling alliances. Like, you give out war guarantees to too many places, you might have to fight a lot more wars than you otherwise would have fought. And also, like, we're in this weird position where America postures like they're so tough, but really when it comes down to it, we're not going to war in Ukraine. There's no political will here. Like, I'm sorry, try to convince the American people we should send our boys to get, like, I understand you're from the region, but like for you, or you have roots from there, but like to the average American, the idea of going to war over whether Luhansk is ruled by Kiev or Moscow is just, they don't even know what Luhansk is. And if they met someone from there, would probably just assume they were Russian. You know what I mean? Like, and they might be, but whatever. I think the first step to a path to peace is that you have to want to get a path to peace. So I think Trump's doing a good job in that.
Do you think all three sides want peace, from what you understand? Obviously, Trump legitimately, fully, with an urgency, wants peace.
I think for sure Trump wants peace. I also think Putin wants to wrap the conflict up. And I think that Putin has been willing to deal for the entire lead up to the war and pretty much throughout the war. And there's been a lot of solid reporting on this. And I mean, the sources on it are pretty impeccable. The head of NATO, Stoltenberg, I always mess up his name, but he literally said that in late 2021, that Vladimir Putin actually sent a draft agreement to NATO, and that his condition for not invading is like, I will not invade, but you have to put it in writing. Like, he sent a draft treaty to them. You have to put in writing that Ukraine will not join NATO. And then Stoltenberg bragged about how he said, no, because we won't let Vladimir Putin dictate to us whether we can expand NATO or not. And then he was bragging. He was like, and look what he got. More NATO expansion, Finland and this and that. So look at that. And it didn't even seem to notice, like, that, wait a minute, you're admitting that you could have just promised not to bring Ukraine into NATO and saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Seems like it would have been a much better deal. It's going to be a much better deal than what Ukraine will ultimately end up getting. So I think also the Joe Biden's CIA director, who was a CIA director his whole 4 years, William Burns, when he was ambassador to Russia, he wrote the "Niet means Niet." And in the memo, and again, this was dumped by Julian Assange, this wasn't for the public. This was just him writing to Condoleezza Rice to tell the Secretary of State his assessment. And he said that his exact words were, a decision Russia does not want to have to make. And this was the decision about whether to invade Ukraine or not. And he was like, they say, if you keep pushing for Ukrainian entry into NATO, this could lead to a civil war, and even worse. And in that situation, Russia would have to decide whether or not to intervene, a decision Russia does not want to have to make. So essentially, it's like, I think it's pretty clear from all sides that Putin didn't want it to come to this. And look, I mean, even after the coup in 2014, he took Crimea, but he didn't invade the country. I mean, he may have sent special forces in, but I mean, not the full-scale 2022 invasion. And even for the Civil War, going all that, he did, it seemed like I'm not defending the decision. I'm just saying it seemed like he reluctantly debate. What was it in 2014 or 15 when they had the plebiscites in Crimea and in the Donbass region, and they voted to be independent? He didn't take them then. I mean, he could have used that as a pretense for like, hey, they voted to be with us, and he didn't. I think he wants to end the war. Zelensky, from everything he's said publicly, seems like he still feels like, I mean, I'm just taking him at his word here, that it's like, well, no, look, like, we could end the war, but we got to end the war. It seems like he's moved from his position being like, no, we have to reclaim all of our territory, to now his position is kind of like, all right, maybe we don't reclaim all of it, but we got to be given some type of security guarantee in the future. I think the problem with that is just, again, like, I don't mean to be cruel about this, because like it sucks that there's little countries that are next to big countries that kind of get bullied around about them, but there also is a bit of an entitlement to demanding a security guarantee. Like, what exactly do you mean? From America? What, that we'll go to war if you're invaded? Why do we owe that to anybody? Like, that's crazy. I'm sorry. You can just sign up to say that we'll go to war if anybody invades anybody. I mean, I hope nobody invades anybody, but that I don't want us to get dragged into that. That's a recipe for always being at war, and I don't think that's right for our country. So essentially, I think Trump and Putin want peace. And if that's the case, I think we'll ultimately get to an end of this war.
So there's a lot of stuff to say here. Let's actually start at the beginning, at the foundation of this. I think the thing that we left unsaid that's important to say is that Putin invaded Ukraine in February 24th, 2022. And I think he is, at least from my perspective, the person who started the war. You could talk about NATO expansion. You could talk about any other thing that led to it. You could start at the collapse of the Soviet Union. You can go all the way back as he did, 1,000 years. The reality is, and this goes to our deep discussion about the morality of war, no matter the reasons, the guy that pulls the trigger first, non-accidentally, and keeps pulling the trigger, that's the guy who's at fault.
Oh, I agree. I'll say one standard for everybody. The standard that I laid out before is the same one I said. It's like, did you absolutely have to do that? Once you start killing people by the hundreds of thousands, it's like, was there any other option? Are you telling me like you absolutely had to do this? And I don't think that's right. My friend Scott Horton, who I was talking to you about, who just totally brilliant guy, even in his book, there's a whole chapter of all the other options of what Vladimir Putin could do. So you're absolutely right. And there's a weird thing where people say, if you say that the West provoked this conflict, that is a very different thing than saying that that this invasion was justified. And in the same way that if you were at a bar and someone goes and spits in another guy's face and then he pulls out a gun and murders him right there, he's not justified in doing that. That is not okay. You don't get to murder someone because they spit in your face. Also, if you were talking about why did he murder that guy, I'd be like, oh, because he walked up and spit in his face. That's why it happened. And that is essentially my contention about this war. And it is, I think it's just crystal clear that that's why it happened. Listen, it may be right or it may be wrong. But if China or Russia ever backed a street putsch to overthrow the democratically elected government in Mexico and then install a pro-Chinese or a pro-Russian government and then started pumping arms into that conflict and then kept floating out the idea that they were going to bring them into their military alliance, DC would simply not allow that. You cannot do that. Any more than the Soviet Union could put nukes in Cuba. Sorry.
That should be said that's really Cold War 20th century neocon thinking, right? It is the way the world works, but that's you should still punish.
I don't think outside of the neoconservatives, listen, whether you're talking about the neoconservatives or going way before any other group that has ever had control of U.S. foreign policy, going back to the Cold Warriors, the Truman administration, the Eisenhower administration. I think you could take this back to Thomas Jefferson. If this happened in 1801, there is simply no way that they would allow a foreign great power to come bring our neighbor, overthrow their government, and then bring our neighbor into their military alliance. I think there's no great power that would ever tolerate that.
First of all, we're in a post-nuclear world, right? So, meaning there's nuclear weapons. So the threat of somebody being on your border is just not the same kind of threat when you're a nuclear power, which is why, you look at Finland.
No, I think in some ways it's more of a threat in some ways.
Well, Putin is not upset about Finland joining NATO nearly as much.
Look, I'm just saying, to Vladimir Putin, in his own words, what his issue always was the military hardware that comes along with NATO membership. So it's not just that you get into NATO, but then you get all that military hardware there. And he made a huge deal about the dual-use rocket launchers in Poland, which George W. Bush put there after 9/11. So I think all of those things are factors. I think Ukraine, the Crimea being their only year-long warm water port, I think there's like several, elements to it. But I do think a huge part of it is that the country's been invaded through Ukraine multiple times. And so there's just, he, I think, very reasonably within the grading on a curve of how reasonable governments are, he saw that as a security threat.
But we should make very clear, because the way that comes across, the full responsibility of the invasion of Ukraine lays at the hands of Vladimir Putin.
Sure. I completely agree with that. Vladimir Putin launched a war where, again, I don't know exactly what the numbers are. I've read a whole bunch of estimates, some that contradict each other, but the consensus seems to be it's at least in the hundreds of thousands, possibly well north of 1 million, if you're talking about the casualties on both sides. And Vladimir Putin launched a war that led to that. And he's responsible for that. That being said, you can also point out that really what we're talking about here is the George H.W. Bush administration, the Clintons, Bush again, Obama, and then Trump, and the people who were in charge of the foreign policy in those administrations, the same ones who gave us Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Somalia, Yemen, they were also in charge of our European foreign policy, and they had the most reckless the most reckless policy of all was their NATO policy, and that they drove up to this conflict with Russia with nothing but off-ramp after off-ramp after off-ramp, and consciously decided that we're not going to take any of those. We're going to drive it all the way up to this point. And Thomas Friedman for the New York Times interviewed George Kennan in 1998, and George Kennan was the Cold Warrior. He's credited as founding the containment strategy in the Cold War. And he was talking about the first round of NATO expansion, which he and many other foreign policy graybeards opposed. And he was like, this is the worst thing we could possibly do after the fall of the Soviet Union, to now say that we had this alliance in NATO that was an anti-Russian military alliance. And now that the Soviet Union isn't there anymore, and it's Boris Yeltsin's Russia, that now we're going to expand NATO because of that. And he literally said in 1998, he goes, the people advocating that we expand NATO are going to continue advocating it and advocating it and advocating it. And then there will be a Russian reaction. And then they'll say, see, that's why we were right to expand NATO. But they'll get this completely wrong.
When do you think a deal is reached?
I really have no idea what the timeline is going to look like. I'm hoping sooner rather than later. I think Donald Trump would love nothing more than to have some type of big spectacle of ending this war, some type of big press conference or some type of, you know what I mean? And so I'm sure, my guess would be that's where Trump's mind is how to do this in the best way that sells him the best. But I think that already we're in a position where Donald Trump has put a lot of political capital chips into the middle of the table that I can end this war, and he's going to look very, very bad if he can't. So he's very highly incentivized to get this thing done as quick as possible. And so hopefully that can happen soon. It would be great if it could happen in the next month.
Yeah, people on both sides outside of Donald Trump were telling me that it's a process.
Yeah.
There's a kind of implication is gonna take a while, which I really hate. I really love Donald Trump's urgency.
Well, it's also terrible. There's something really awful, like, look, when innocent people dying in war at any time is terrible, but there is something profoundly awful, and I'm old enough now that I've seen this a few times happen, or I've lived through it a few times. I've read about it happening earlier, but it's like once you've kind of already decided the war's over and people still die, you know what I mean? There's something almost like sadder about that because it's always like, come on, you already know, like when there'd be like a big, there'd be like a bombing campaign in Afghanistan, like when we all already knew we were a few months away from ending the war. You're like, oh, you got to kill more people like on the way out. We already know we're leaving. We already know that because there's something, at least in the beginning, they could kind of hide behind this justification, or they could be like, listen, we're going to overthrow the Taliban and we're going to install our new government. They're going to be a democracy. It's going really good. We have to do this in order to do this bigger project. But then by the end, you're like, we're not even pretending anymore that we're doing anything more positive. It's just someone dying in a senseless thing we never should have been in.